Welcome to the show. This is Jason Hartman, your host, and every 10th episode, we do something kind of special, kind of different. What we do is we go off topic. So regardless of which show it is on the Hartman Media Network, whether it be one of the financial shows, economics, real estate investing, travel, longevity, all of the other topics that we have, every 10th episode, we go off topic and we explore something of general interest, something of general life success value. And so many of our listeners around the world in 164 countries have absolutely loved our 10th episode shows. So that's what we're going to do today. And let's go ahead and get to our guest with a special 10th episode show. And of course, on the next episode, we'll be back to our regular programming. Here we go.
This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to the Creating Wealth Show with Jason Hartman. You're about to learn a new slant on investing, some exciting techniques, and fresh new approaches to the world's most historically proven asset class that will enable you to create more wealth and freedom than you ever thought possible. Jason is a genuine self-made multimillionaire who's actually been there and done it. He's a successful investor, lender, developer, and entrepreneur who's owned properties in 11 states, had hundreds of tenants, and been involved in thousands of real estate transactions. This program will help you follow in Jason's footsteps on the road to your financial independence day. You really can do it. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman, with the complete solution for real estate investors.
It is my pleasure to welcome Michael Wilkerson to the show. He is the author of Why America Matters, the case for a new exceptionalism. Michael, welcome. How are you?
Jason, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you today.
It's good to have you. Where are you located?
I'm in Palm Beach, Florida.
So am I. We're neighbors, and I didn't even know that. So that's fantastic. You know, there's been a lot of talk about American exceptionalism over the years, and we have listeners in 189 countries worldwide, and some might disagree with that. Is it fair to sort of single out the U.S. as a different type of country in that way?
Well, I think it's hard to argue with the fact, not a question, but the fact of American exceptionalism, because it is what it is. You can't, as Charles Murray, once said, it's no more debatable than the question of did the Battle of Gettysburg exist? It's a thing. Now, we have certain things that make this nation truly exceptional that just simply do not exist and have not existed elsewhere. I'm not talking about our material wealth or prosperity or military power or otherwise, but I'm talking about the entire suite of ideals and values that formed the nation, that were unique at the time, if not as an ideas, but at least in practice. In other words, nowhere in the world were the ideals of America put into place in a new government, in a new experiment. And so, of course, your question on other nations, I would say two things. One, every nation and their people should have something to be proud about in their heritage. We seem to have lost that in a day when patriotism is no longer a virtue. But I would also say that America still matters today because it still has something extraordinary to offer to the world. And it's an inestimable gift, not just to the people of this nation, but to those who love freedom and love the ideas of America anywhere around the world.
So let me just play devil's advocate for a moment on this, and we're going to dive into inflation and financial markets a bit and touch on all of that. But as far as exceptionalism goes, you know, before the Constitution, which is certainly one of the most important documents for the liberty of humanity all over the world, really, because a lot of countries follow that example. It obviously became a revolutionary idea. But we did have before that kind of a clue as to the direction things were going long before with the Magna Carta. And the Constitution, of course, changed everything. It was, maybe the first time there was really a very solid foundation for the idea that government derives its rights from its citizens, not the other way around, which is a wonderful thing. But then we fast forward a little bit and, America won the Industrial Revolution. It won World War II. And it also had the world's biggest PR firm, Hollywood, to sort of spread its ideas and this idea of exceptionalism. other countries didn't have that, but don't they have exceptional things too?
Well, they certainly do. But again, just because someone else has something interesting or exceptional doesn't discount or take away from American exceptionalism. What's interesting about Hollywood is you're absolutely right. Media through mid 20th century was a great promoter and sustainer of American values across the world. And in fact, became a key asset during the Cold War in propagating those virtues and values. Something happened, Jason, in our generation where Hollywood went from being a promoter of American values to being hostile to it, being an influence.
Fair enough. Yeah, we didn't get there yet, but yes, you're right.
We just went through 250 years of history in a brief second, but that element is no longer true. In fact, the opposite is true. That is a force pulling against telling the truth, frankly, about American history and American ideas and values.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And it surprises me that not just the United States, but other Western countries, you look at Western Europe and there's like this self-loathing. I don't understand it. I mean, these countries did great things for the entire human race. Trial by jury, innocent until proven guilty. All of these ideas were really Western ideals. And you know what? It's almost like these countries kind of hate themselves. I don't understand it. And to your point about Hollywood being a detractor now of American values for at least the last couple of decades, at least.
And what I am trying to do in part and why America matters is to remind Americans that there's something here to be proud of, that there is a history, the ideas that you described about, which absolutely came out of the Magna Carta, came out of the Enlightenment, came out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. We seem to be abandoning and repudiating them one by one, but it goes back before the Constitution. Think about the Declaration of Independence. Think about the ideas that all men were created equal, that we had God-given, unalienable rights that couldn't be taken away by any sovereign, by any government, by any bureaucracy. Those are extraordinary things. The ideas were out there, but had never been put into practice. And what concerns me most, and again, partly why I wrote this, is you hit it on the head, which is we seem to be in the West broadly, not just in the US, but across the West. And Douglas Murray talks about this extensively, this idea of having to apologize for our history, having to renounce and negate. Were there bad things? Of course. Should they be reconciled with and understood? Absolutely. But that's a far cry from abandoning the entire canon of our history and the things that made America and the West extraordinary.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And it's almost like these revisionist historians, they're willing to overlook all of the bad and negative things that other cultures and countries did. And they just want to put the negative parts of history solely on Christians and Western countries, namely the US. But it's not like that wasn't the culture of the time. I mean, there's no contextual comparison. Everybody was doing these things. Everybody was barbaric in the past, right? Like
you make an excellent point. And one of the things that people forget is, let's take the biggest issue that affected our country during the first 700 years, which was the issue of the slave trade and slavery in the country. Now, slavery had been around for thousands and thousands of years. So the idea that all men were created equal, that was the revolution. Right. That was the crazy thought, which again came out of the Christian Revolution at the time when Paul said there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, there's neither Jew or Greek. All are the same in the eyes of God. That's a crazy idea because no civilization really practiced that. However, the Constitution compromised on the issue to hold the Union together through the Revolutionary War and beyond. And it cost us. That issue had the question of equality had to be proven with blood and fire. And it took, for example, the abolitionist societies, the volunteer organizations through churches and communities, but it also took radicals like John Quincy Adams fighting for it for 30 years in the House. And of course, a bloody civil war in order for that to become even partially a reality. And we still, of course, have work to do. But it's this sort of thing. It's not that these ideas aren't in tension. It's not that we don't have to fight for them. We do. But are they worthy to aspire to? Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, and there's obviously no one answer for this, but where did this, back to that kind of self-loathing ideal that we were talking about a moment ago, where's that coming from? I mean, why would progressives, the wrongly named group, but I mean, do they hate America? Do they hate Western values? Why would they?
Well, they think they're
benefiting
but they
from
don't.
them. I don't understand it.
Yeah, so they use the freedoms and benefits of the free market system and the ideals of this country in order to propagate ideas and values that are contrary to them. They couldn't do that in the communist or socialist world that they design, where you're only allowed to say something that's consistent with the party, consistent with the regime. The where and why, it's a long story, but really this comes out of postmodernism in the universities, critical theory in the universities, that taught that, first of all, that God wasn't there. And since there's no God, there's no absolutes. If there's no absolutes, then language doesn't have any meaning. It's only about power and constructing a world that you want on your own ideas. And with this came the complete renunciation of, as I said, words and meaning, but also the values, the ideas that individuals mattered in shaping the history. So they're very anti-hero. You know, we can't talk about Abraham Lincoln as a hero, even though he did amazing things and set free the slave population in the U.S. We can't talk about extraordinary events because they don't matter. It's obviously I'm encapsulating a very complex subject into a few lines, but that's where it began. And that postmodernism, the critical theories, took on the cynical detachment from everything that Americans believed was true. It's taken about 4 or 5 decades now for those ideas to really seep out broadly across the culture, in media, in education, and everywhere else. And that's the point we're in right now, where I think in some ways we're at the beginning stages of a reaction against that, because people around the world, and especially parents, when it comes to the indoctrination of their children, start to realize, hold on, this is actually affecting my life. This isn't some academic theory. This is corroding and corrupting everything that I hold dear.
You know, you mentioned the universities, and of course, those have become just far left brainwashing institutions. It's so amazing. I mean, did that start with the professors or the students? And regardless of which one, obviously they work together, but I'm trying to get to why they would be that way, why they would think what they think. I mean, if you look at college professors, you know, they have tenure, they can't be fired. They work about 12 hours a week. They live in a womb. It is not the real world, right? It's a world of theory and ivory towers. Is that it? Is that where it started?
Think about the evolution of the debate. So if you go back to the 60s and early 70s, this was a fringe idea. This was in the sociology department. This was in some anthropology. It was way in the humanities, deep, hidden away. By the time I was in university, which would have been 30-ish years ago, it was out in the open, but it was being debated. In other words, conservative views had a place at the table to debate. So this continued evolution has come to a point where today, students or professors holding conservative views that don't align with a woke ideology, that don't align with this radicalist, progressive element, do not have a voice. They're being censored in practice or in policy or in practice or in effect. As a parent of university-age students, I understand the amount of pressure, really tyranny from these structures to keep students and professors from speaking out and saying or even thinking the things that they believe are challenging in a healthy debate, for fear of pressure, for fear of bad grades, for fear of being ostracized from the community. So it's really swung in these 40 or 50 years to the other extreme of the pendulum, where not only are these ideas out in the open, but they're repressing every other idea that runs contrary.
Yeah, no question about it. And were there some major turning points? I mean, obviously the 60s was a turning point, the late 60s especially. I talked to a lot of people, and in the university crowd, they seem to say that around 2013, the woke ideology just really gained a whole new foothold. Are there some sort of points that we can look at where
I think absolutely right now? Certainly the biggest one was the kind of cultural and social revolution, political revolution of the 60s, with everything that's going on around civil rights, the war in Vietnam, this great decade of distrust and loss of faith in the American government because of all the lies that it had told to the American people during this period, but also in the ideas of America, really challenging. And there was this great confusing and confounding of the pure ideals versus the more hegemonic, aggressive, imperialist, we've got to do all these things around the world at any cost to our own ideals and our own morality. So there was that. But there's also, I think the parallel would be, and it goes around the same time you're describing in the political process, the political system, really through that period and through the 1990s, at least the arms of government, meaning here, I'm talking about Congress, at least Congress was functioning. People on both sides of the aisle could get together, could find compromises, could get things done. We've seen this great polarization and ossification on both sides where it's resulted in this terrible dysfunction that Americans are having to live through every day. One of the crises I talk about in my book, Why America Matters, is this crisis of institutions that across the board, the federal government really is failing us, both through incompetence, but also through this deep-seated corruption that has emerged over these past decades. So there may be other specific points in time, but you can see how, yes, that over time it's definitely gotten worse. And there did seem to be this breaking point somewhere in the last, let's call it 15 years or so.
Where do we go from here? I mean, throughout history, the pendulum sort of swings back and forth. The famous last words, at least in the investing world, are this time it's different, right? And, maybe it is different this time because now we've got these entrenched big tech companies, and the mainstream media just has such reach. And of course, the educational institutions have been co-opted by the left. Is there ever a time where the pendulum could swing the other way?
I absolutely think that there is. And I think that we're in one now. So why do I think that there is? One, you see, again, going back to our own history, how America has come back from times of great confusion and great conflict. So we talked about the first half of the 19th century before the Civil War. America was never more divided. As bad as it seems right now, it was absolutely much worse then. Somehow the center did hold. Somehow we were able to maintain a more perfect union. Not perfect, but more perfect through that whole process. We're in this period of great divisiveness right now, where it's sort of 40-20, 40% of people don't agree with each other at all. 20% of the people can't get off their couches and behind their screens to care or to matter. But I do believe that the silver lining of the chaos and madness of the last 3 years has been the beginning stages of waking up, of people realizing, wow, there is a lot going on. There's a lot of information and misinformation out there, bringing school curriculums into the homes of parents and families where they realized what was happening, the indoctrination that was going around woke ideology and other things, realizing the lies, the official lies that were going on around origins of the vaccine, origins of the virus, vaccine efficacy and adverse reaction, all these things.
Be careful. The big tech overlords may cancel us.
Well, I think the good news is heading into a period where, even with the revelations of the Twitter files, that all of this is necessary. In other words, the first step to change is to recognize that there's a problem, that with this greater transparency will lead to accountability. That's the path forward. This information that we're getting now through Twitter files, or everything else that's been going on, is like this snowball effect. You're accumulating more and more and more until at some point when it's an avalanche. It cannot be ignored. Okay. With that, let us hope, that comes accountability, comes the ability to do as was done with the Church Committee in the 1970s, to hold Senate investigations, to actually look at some of this stuff. Now, the problem, of course, is, you've said it, these entities are deeply embedded across all kinds of mechanisms, including the links with big tech. So I'm not saying this is easy. I'm actually acknowledging very serious issues that we're facing. But with that realism comes some hope, some optimism that we are in early stages of the pendulum swinging back, a path forward. Why do I say that? One quick example would just be the grit and courage of the parents of Loudoun County, Virginia, and elsewhere to stand up in the face of federal government intimidation from the Department of Justice and carry on and continue to fight their fight for parental rights, which resulted in a change in the board of supervisors of that school district and a new governor who had run on a platform of parental rights. That's one example, but I think it's illustrative for the kind of courage that Americans need to have to believe that with enough resistance, with resistance is power.
I hope you're right. I take an even harder line on this stuff. I think we need to see some indictments. I mean, some of these people in government and some of these executives of these big tech companies should be indicted for crimes against humanity. They have violated our constitutional rights. The tech companies should be held liable for that because they have become proxies of the government, and the government is not allowed to violate your civil rights. Of course, a private company can do what they want, as they all say, but these are not private companies anymore. They are companies that are acting as arms of the government. And we saw that from the Twitter files. They are just too big to be considered the same as my company or your company, right? When a company like Facebook has a GDP that out of 200 countries in the world is number 74, that's not the same as a private company with competition where you can go down the street and share your ideas elsewhere. Now, thankfully, we're seeing a little bit of relief here with Musk's takeover of Twitter, of course, and other sources like Gab and so forth. But then you get the disgusting people at Apple that take them out of the App Store. I mean, they're just being deplatformed. I just can't believe this is happening. These companies, after the January 6th era, have really made an extraordinary effort and are succeeding in creating a memory hole in history where people just don't know what happened anymore.
And this entire subject is one of the main points I hit on Why America Matters, which, by the way, your audience can find at whyamericamatters.com. We'll come back to that. But is this rise of the surveillance state and the rise of this truly Orwellian period of time where our history and the facts of the present are being completely reinvented and inverted. And big tech has absolutely been collusive with the deep state, with the existing powers of the permanent bureaucracy to lie and to confuse us. And so I do agree with your first point that it needs to move beyond just hearings and so-called accountability in that sense to there have been criminal acts. There should be indictments. There should be an upending and a true reform of some of these agencies.
If the narrative they've spread has quite literally killed thousands or millions of people, and who knows how many more in the upcoming years as we see these excess death, mysterious deaths and so forth, why wouldn't that be an indictment? I agree with you. It's unbelievable. It really is. So what is the new exceptionalism? What is different between the new exceptionalism and the old one?
Well, the idea being that we're in the 21st century, we're facing 21st century challenges. The exceptionalism of the 19th century or the 20th is not appropriate. Here's an example. We spent our first 150 years in this splendid isolation. Our point, America had, we'd left the entangling wars of Europe. We said, we're not going to focus over there. We had obviously the entirety of the continent to settle. The Monroe Doctrine sort of put that in writing long before we actually had the power to enforce it. But the idea was, Europe, you stay out of the Western Hemisphere and we'll stay out of your troubles. That obviously came to an abrupt and screeching halt in the First World War and the Second World War. And we moved into this new phase of interventionalism, which moved, as we got closer to the end of the century, hyper-interventionalism, where as the sole remaining superpower, global hegemon, global police putting out fires everywhere, it really did swing, I think, to an inappropriate extreme where we had given up on soft power, which is going back to the point of Hollywood and influence, and we're relying solely on hard power, our military might, to try to make people by point of bayonet love American values and American ideals. Failed miserably in the context of endless wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere. We don't seem to have learned a lesson given what we're trying to do now in Ukraine, which is start a proxy war with Russia. Yep. So the argument goes, neither of those periods, neither of those actions are essential, that the new exceptionalism means recognizing that, again, being a patriot is a good thing. It's a virtue, not a vice, to love your country. That nationalism in this new era is much more important and realistic and efficacious than this sort of imperialist era that we were in for the last 70 years. So it's slightly more constrained. It's this idea of America first. And by the way, I do think we're in an era of many nations first, France first, Japan first, China first, et cetera. Why? Because we've seen the failure of globalism. We've seen the failure of open borders, open markets through the pandemic. the effect on supply chains, time after time, a country relying on a potential adversary for their strategic needs, as we found with China and as Germany has now found with Russia. We're in this big shift back to nation first. And I think America's new greatness for the 21st century will be found in that middle ground or third way between those two other extremes of isolationism and hyper interventionism.
Yeah, I agree. Let's kind of switch gears if we can for a moment and talk a little bit about the economy and inflation. This is a topic we discuss frequently on the show. So many people don't realize or think of inflation as a hidden tax. It's so odd, and we should still marvel at this. The Federal Reserve was created, and then almost immediately afterwards, the IRS was created. So we not only would be taxed once through inflation and the devaluation of our savings stocks, bonds, but we'd also be taxed indirectly, with the cut of our paychecks, right? Where do you think we are in terms of inflation, and where do you think we're going?
I'm going to be the minority report here and say we're still in early days and we're not done. I started writing aggressively about inflation in mid-2020 when it was clearly viewed as a fringe idea. It's no longer considered fringe, at least, although what is fringe is the idea that we're not through it, that it's not coming down. Look at and you're going to know this, but just as a quick reminder for your audience, since the global financial crisis, M2 money supply has increased threefold. Okay, there are 3 times as many dollars chasing an economy growing at, say, 2 or 3% over that period of time. We've had 7% money growth in 15 plus years. National debt is now $31 trillion, 125-ish percent of GDP, debt to GDP, 91,000 per citizen. All of these facts mean that inflation, so it goes back to basically a monetary view of inflation, which is that inflation will not abate until it is caught up to this increase in the money supply. If you look at the history of inflations in the 20th century, it catches up, but it lags by several years. So when people said after the global financial crisis, well, we've increased the money supply, why hasn't inflation occurred? You look at histories, even in the German and the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, they kept printing money, they kept expanding the money supply for, I believe it was 8 years, until in the 9th year, hyperinflation really took hold and set in. They believed they could do it because the effects weren't that bad. To your earlier point, when you have excessive debt like this, when governments are no longer able to manage the debt, you only have 3 options: default, explicit taxation, or taxation implicitly through inflation. Some countries, smaller countries, developing countries, have chosen to default over time. That is not an option for the issuer of a global reserve currency. So that leaves only taxation and inflation. At some point with taxes, eventually the torches and pitchforks come out. You can't continue to tax away explicitly the wealth of a nation without political upheaval. The option that governments always and everywhere choose is to inflate away their debt, is to allow inflation to run hot, and think about the trade-off between inflation and recession or unemployment. You also can't have 25% unemployment without serious political issues and upheavals. So inflation becomes the least horrible of all the policy options, monetary options that the government can pursue. And for those 2 reasons, the monetary view of inflation and the view of the political reality that there is no other option, I argue that we're still seeing we will still continue to see inflation run much hotter than expected. Not even to mention, Jason, the classic argument that CPI doesn't really tell the true story.
Right.
I just wrote an article focusing on what's happening in electricity. So we saw headline inflation come down to 6.5 from 9.1 by the end of the year. That was a nice improvement, but let's not forget the base effects. Inflation's been now running for 2 years, which means the loss of American purchasing power is 15% compounded across those 2 years. And the real things that people consume, food and energy, those numbers are much higher than the nominal headline CPI of 6.5. Take electricity up 14% nationwide, according to the same CPI statistics, 16% in year over year in big cities. If you're fortunate enough to live in the Northeast, it's been 22.8% year over year increase in electricity. And it's only just begun. All of the big power companies here in Florida, California, across the nation have proposals out there for increases between 10 and 20% in 2023. And we're seeing gas and other prices go back up. So Just to close that out, I think we're not through it yet. We haven't seen the worst.
Yeah, I agree with you. Ever since about 1980, give or take, the CPI has become a complete scam. It's I call it the CP lie. Okay. And I would argue that real inflation, everybody spends differently, obviously, so we all have our own personal inflation rate, but real inflation for most Americans is 15 to 17%. And you just cited energy. Of course, they manipulate that. They take it out of the core rate. They don't include food and energy just so they can hide inflation. It's unbelievable. And with the massive amount of debt and unfunded mandates that we have coming at us over the next 15 years, I would say we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of real inflation and how bad this can get. Would you agree with that? I know you think inflation there's still more ahead, but how bad do you think it could get?
Well, I've said several times publicly that I think in the medium term, meaning in the next 3 to 5 years, that we're likely to see inflation somewhere between 8 and 12%. That already
on the CPI.
The equivalent, exactly.
Right, yeah, the CPI.
Yeah. The real effects, it could be much worse. I don't have a specific number in mind, and for good reason, because once inflation really breaks, what is the difference between 50, 100, and 500% inflation? At that point, it starts to become, then you're into this period of hyperinflation where all bets are off, and those numbers start to become somewhat meaningless over time. And we've seen this around the world in other countries. So let's pray that I'm wrong, that you're wrong. But I do think that the issues that you're raising as well, on top of those that I've mentioned already, they're not going away anytime soon, and not likely to be solved without real intervention.
Yeah, I agree. And inflation forces people, especially sadly elderly people who depended on Social Security, their own pension, their savings, it forces them to go out farther on the risk curve to protect themselves against inflation. And older people should not be investing in cryptocurrencies, right? These very speculative investments, if you want to call them that even, they should be able to just have their money in a CD and maybe buy some conservative bonds and be fine in their retirement years. But sadly, that has been taken away, hasn't it?
And this is the greatest risk, that it's the most vulnerable who are most impacted by inflation. It is the retirees. Now, some of them associated with federal government, they get CPI indexed increases, but to your point, that even that doesn't really cover it. But for many, when they're literally relying on savings and other things, but the value is being diminished by 10% or more a year, and the working and middle class who are already going from paycheck to paycheck, seeing the value of what they have diminish over time, the elite class, so to speak, rentiers, find a way to trade through inflation and make money on it. Yep. But so again, it really hurts those least able to take care of it, which is part of the injustice and the tragedy of the whole thing.
Yeah, it really is. It's the wealth transfer. It's a hidden tax, and it also encourages people to take on more debt because their debt is debased through inflation. That sort of keeps this debt cycle going on and on indefinitely, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
What we have to know about it, though, is, as you mentioned earlier, it is really the best business plan for governments is just to inflate away their own debt. So I think the likelihood of it continuing for a long, long time to come is extremely high, isn't it?
And the important point in what you're saying there is to realize that no matter what a government says, no matter what its spokespeople say about how they're going to fight inflation and slay the dragon, first of all, they have no motive to do so.
Right.
And secondly, they have no power to actually do so once you get to a certain point. So I suppose the message to your audience is, don't listen to the words. Remember that it's a tax. Remember that there are only 3 options. This is the only one that's viable, and it's going to happen. It's in the interest of the largest debtor, which is the U.S. government,
right,
to base the value of that debt to make it easier to pay down.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I always say, philosophically, I'm very against it, but align your interest with the most powerful forces, and that's the governments and the central banks. Yeah. It's all we can do, really. Michael, give out your website. You can find the book in all the usual places, of course. It's fantastic, but any website or
two things I'd say just to mention. So Why America Matters, the book specifically, if you want to learn more, go to whyAmericaMatters.com. Easy to remember, whyAmericaMatters.com. And you can find all of my writings, articles, media, etc. at stormwall.com. Stormwall is one word, stormwall.com. You can find me there. You can reach me there and hear what I have to say, which hopefully is more aligned with the truth than with the continued deception that we're getting out of the mainstream media.
Excellent. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.